Imagine a completely free Saturday afternoon. No unfinished tasks, no urgent messages, nothing that needs you right now. An afternoon you planned for, looked forward to, and that arrived exactly as you hoped it would. And then, somewhere in the middle of that afternoon, a feeling appears that you never invited. It's not exactly discomfort. It's not anxiety in the usual sense. It's something more specific than that. It's the feeling that you should be doing something. Not because anything is urgent, not because someone is waiting for you, but because sitting still without being productive, even when rest was the plan, awakens a very particular kind of uneasiness, one that feels unmistakably like guilt. And the question that is rarely asked about this pattern isn't, how do I stop feeling this? It's an older question. Where does this feeling come from? Why does simply not being productive carry the emotional weight of having done something wrong? To answer that accurately, we have to go beyond individual psychology, because this guilt didn't appear out of nowhere. It has a history much older than any one person's life. At the beginning of the 20th century, sociologist Max Weber published a work that would become one of the most influential texts in the social sciences, The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism. Weber's central argument was this: the Protestant Reformation, especially Calvinism, produced a profound cultural shift in the way work came to be understood throughout the Western world. Before the Reformation, work was largely viewed as a worldly necessity, a way of sustaining physical life, but not a way of expressing moral or spiritual worth. The contemplative life, solitude, prayer, stillness, was often regarded as higher than manual labor or commercial activity. Calvinist theology reversed that hierarchy. The doctrine of predestination, the belief that salvation was determined by God rather than earned through human actions, created a uniquely psychological dilemma. How can I know whether I am among the saved? How could anyone have any sign of being one of the chosen? The practical answer that gradually emerged was through worldly success, through hard work, discipline, and achievement, not as a way of earning salvation, but as evidence that grace was already present. Working tirelessly became, within that framework, proof that you belonged on the right side. Not working, wasting time, resting beyond what seemed necessary, allowing yourself leisure, became, implicitly, evidence of moral weakness. A sign that perhaps you were not worthy of grace after all. Weber documented how, over the centuries, this ethic gradually moved from its religious origins into secular culture. The connection between work and salvation faded away, but the connection between work and moral worth remained, transformed, internalized, passed from one generation to the next. The original religious language disappeared. The emotional weight did not. What does that mean for an ordinary Saturday afternoon? It means that the guilt of not being productive isn't a personal quirk. It's the residue of centuries spent linking work with virtue and rest with laziness at one of the deepest levels of Western culture. You didn't invent that equation. It existed long before you did. It lived in the messages you received about what makes someone worthy, in the phrases you heard about laziness, about wasted potential, about the virtue of always working harder, in an entire cultural architecture that you inherited without ever choosing it. But there's something even more specific about the way this guilt operates that cultural history alone cannot fully explain, because simply knowing that this equation came from outside you isn't enough to stop it from operating inside you. To understand why it continues working even after someone intellectually recognizes that rest is necessary and healthy, we need to understand something about how emotions actually work, something very different from what most people imagine. Neuroscientist Lisa Feldman Barrett at Northeastern University has spent decades challenging what she calls the myth of hardwired basic emotions. The traditional view assumed that emotions such as fear, anger, joy, and guilt are automatic, universal responses, that the brain simply detects a certain situation and reflexively produces the corresponding emotion, as though each emotion had its own dedicated neural circuit waiting for the right trigger. But decades of neuroimaging research and cross-cultural studies led Barrett to a different conclusion. Emotions are constructed. The brain doesn't detect a situation and then generate the matching emotion. Instead, it predicts what that situation most likely means, drawing on past experience, cultural learning, and deeply internalized patterns, and constructs the emotion from that prediction. An emotion is not a direct reading of reality. It is an interpretation, a hypothesis the brain generates about what this situation most likely represents. Now apply that to sitting quietly on a Saturday afternoon. The brain doesn't detect inactivity and automatically produce guilt. It detects inactivity. It searches through decades of personal and cultural learning about what inactivity is supposed to mean. Then it constructs the emotion that your history predicts belongs in that situation. For someone raised in an environment, cultural, familial, or both, where inactivity was consistently associated with inadequacy, laziness, or wasted potential, the emotion constructed in response to rest becomes guilt, not because the brain is malfunctioning, but because it is faithfully applying the predictions it learned to make. That changes something fundamental about this pattern. The guilt of not being productive is not evidence that resting is wrong. It is the emotion your nervous system constructed from everything it learned that resting was supposed to mean. But there's another layer to this story, a more personal one, a more immediate one that explains why guilt doesn't appear only when rest feels like too much. It explains why it appears most strongly at precisely the moments when you needed to stop the most, and why in those moments it takes on a different quality. A quality that goes beyond feeling as though you've done something wrong and begins to feel as though you yourself are the problem. Why does the guilt of not being productive sometimes feel far bigger than it should? Why isn't it simply the weight of an unproductive afternoon? Why does it sometimes carry something deeper than, "I made a mistake," and begin to feel like it says something about who you are? The answer begins with a distinction that psychologists Edward Deci and Richard Ryan at the University of Rochester mapped out through decades of research on human motivation. Deci and Ryan found that the reasons people do what they do matter just as much as the actions themselves, not from a moral perspective, but from the perspective of the nervous system and psychological well-being. They identified two fundamental types of motivation. Autonomous motivation comes from within. You do something because you genuinely find it meaningful, because it aligns with your values, because the activity itself matters to you, not because you need someone's approval, not because you're afraid of what will happen if you don't do it, but because you want to. Controlled motivation comes from pressure, either external or internal. You do something because you'll feel guilty if you don't, because your self-image depends on continuing to do it, because stopping would force you to face something about yourself that constant activity has been keeping out of sight. Here's the crucial point. When productivity is driven primarily by controlled motivation, when you stay productive to avoid the guilt of not producing, to preserve the image of yourself as an efficient and worthwhile person, to avoid the discomfort of being still, productivity stops being simply something you do. It becomes a source of self, a structure that supports your sense of who you are. And then something very specific happens. When productivity disappears, you don't just feel as though you've done something wrong. You feel that the very foundation of your identity is being threatened. Think about the difference between two people experiencing a weekend in which they accomplish nothing. For someone whose productivity is driven by autonomous motivation, someone who works because they genuinely want to, and who rests with the same clarity they work with, an unproductive weekend is simply a weekend. No special credit, no special failure. Just a period of recovery that the nervous system recognizes as part of a healthy cycle. For someone whose productivity is driven by controlled motivation, someone who produces in order to protect their self-image, to silence the inner voice that says not doing means not being enough, that same unproductive weekend becomes a threat, not to their work, to themselves, to the evidence that they are capable, valuable, worthy of respect, from themselves as much as from anyone else. This is where researcher June Price Tangney at George Mason University offers a distinction that completely changes the way we understand this pattern. Tangney spent decades studying the difference between two emotions that people often confuse: guilt and shame. Guilt, in the technical sense Tangney uses the term, is focused on behavior. I did something wrong. I made a mistake in this specific situation. That action wasn't right. healthy guilt leaves the self intact. It is about what I did, not about who I am. And it has a direct path forward. Repair what happened, change the behavior, learn from the mistake. Shame is focused on the self. I am a bad person. I'm not good enough. What does this say about who I really am? Shame doesn't offer the same direct path out that guilt does. Because the problem isn't a behavior that can be changed. It's an identity that feels threatened. What Tangney documented, and what speaks directly to what we're exploring, is that guilt and shame often occur together. And for people who are especially sensitive to shame, situations that begin as guilt have a tendency to slide into shame. I didn't accomplish anything today. That begins as behavioral guilt. I'm the kind of person who wastes the day. That becomes identity-based shame. For someone whose identity has been built around productivity, someone whom Deci and Ryan would describe as operating through introjected regulation, where external standards have been absorbed as internal rules, that slide happens almost automatically. An unproductive afternoon is no longer just an afternoon. It becomes a window into the very question that constant productivity has been keeping closed. Who am I when I'm not producing? And when there isn't a secure answer to that question, when the self has been built in such a way that productivity is what holds it together, simply having nothing to do makes the question impossible to ignore. Think about how this appears in everyday life. The person who brings their laptop on vacation, just in case, and ends up opening it during the first 2 days. Not because anyone actually needed them, but because being disconnected from their usual source of self-worth became harder to tolerate than they expected. The professional who finds themselves inventing tasks on an otherwise free afternoon, reorganizing the desk, rereading emails that were already answered. Not because any of it was necessary, but because staying in motion temporarily eased the guilt that silence was creating. The person who, while recovering from an illness and under strict instructions to rest, is still answering work messages at 11 o'clock at night, with a fever. Not because of extraordinary professional commitment, but because stepping away from productivity triggered a level of identity-related discomfort that the illness itself had never created. In every one of these examples, what is happening is not a conscious decision to become a workaholic. It is a nervous system that has learned, through years of controlled motivation, that productivity isn't simply what you do. It's what guarantees that you are. And when that source of certainty disappears long enough, the emotion that emerges is no longer just guilt about your behavior. It becomes the deepest kind of threat for an identity-oriented nervous system. The threat of not being enough once the evidence of being enough has been taken away. If you've ever recognized yourself in this pattern, that specific inability to rest without paying an emotional price, this channel exists to give that experience a name. Subscribe so the next video is already waiting for you. But there's another layer beyond identity and motivation, one that explains something people often notice in themselves without understanding why. Why, the moment they try to rest, the mind refuses to stay quietly in the empty space. Instead, it immediately starts generating a list of other things that could be done. Why rest doesn't activate only guilt, but also a kind of compensatory urgency, a restless search for something, anything, to do. Not necessarily work, just something that fills the space where work would have been. And the explanation for this very specific pattern lies in a mechanism that comes online whenever the self senses that one of its primary sources of stability is being threatened. There is a pattern that appears with remarkable consistency in people who experience intense guilt when they are not being productive. The moment rest begins, the moment work-related pressure eases enough for space to open up, the system does not rest. It searches. It searches for something else to do. Not the same kind of work, but anything that has the structure of a task. Anything that creates the feeling of moving forward. Anything that recreates, even in a different form, the experience of being productive. The house gets organized with an urgency that never appeared during the work week. The closet that was perfectly fine suddenly needs a complete reorganization. The hobby that once existed for enjoyment quietly turns into a project with goals and informal deadlines. Rest is transformed almost imperceptibly into scheduled rest, with a list of shows to watch, walking schedules, and timed periods for relaxation. It's not that the person is incapable of enjoying these activities. It's that they are pursuing them not because of the pleasure they provide, but because of the sense of fulfillment they create. They become functional substitutes for the productivity that has been temporarily suspended. Social psychologist Claude Steele from Stanford University spent decades studying what happens when a person experiences a threat to an important domain of the self. His self-affirmation theory proposes something deeply counterintuitive. When the self is threatened in one specific area, when evidence of inadequacy or failure appears in a domain that matters, the system does not necessarily try to solve the problem in that same domain. Instead, it seeks to affirm the value of the self somewhere else. If professional competence feels threatened, the person may seek affirmation through generosity, relationships, or physical abilities. If their identity as a parent feels uncertain, they may compensate by becoming even more devoted to work. When the self is threatened, it does not remain still. It looks for restoration, wherever restoration is available. Now apply this mechanism to rest. For a system whose identity has been built largely around productivity, rest itself represents a threat to the self, not to the conscious self-concept. The person intellectually understands that rest is healthy, but to the self-affirmation system that operates beneath conscious awareness and, according to Steele, becomes activated whenever the perceived value of the self falls below a tolerable threshold. What does the system do in response to that threat? It does not simply remain frozen in guilt. It actively searches for another way to affirm its value. And the available options during a period of rest become household chores, hobbies transformed into projects, online courses that suddenly need to be started, or elaborate plans for the coming week. None of this is the sabotage of rest. It is the self-affirmation system doing exactly what it evolved to do. Protect the sense of self whenever it feels threatened, even when the threat is, objectively, nothing more than a free afternoon. But there is another dimension to this pattern that psychologist and moral philosopher Jonathan Haidt from New York University explored from an entirely different perspective. Haidt spent years studying how certain behaviors become moralized, how they stop being simple preferences or choices and begin carrying the emotional weight of moral obligations. What he found is that moral emotions, guilt, shame, outrage, are activated specifically when behaviors considered morally significant are violated or threatened. And once a behavior becomes integrated into a person's moral framework, or into the moral framework of an entire culture, violating that behavior no longer produces simple discomfort. It produces an emotional response with the distinctive quality of moral transgression. Now think about how this applies to productivity. In cultures shaped by the work ethic that Max Weber described, productivity is not merely valued. It has been moralized. Being productive is not simply efficient. It means being responsible, committed, and worthy. Not being productive is not simply inefficient. It means being lazy, irresponsible, self-indulgent, words that are not neutral. They are moral judgments. Once productivity has been moralized in this way, the guilt of not producing no longer feels like I wasted an afternoon. It feels like I committed a moral failure, and moral failures trigger more than practical regret. They carry the emotional weight of violating something deeply important. This is why the guilt of not being productive can feel wildly disproportionate to the actual situation. An unproductive afternoon rarely has meaningful real-world consequences. Yet the emotion it generates can feel as intense as the guilt of having done something genuinely wrong, because for a system that has internalized the moralization of productivity, that is exactly what seems to have happened. A moral value has been violated, and when moral values are violated, they generate some of the most persistent emotions, and the ones that are hardest to simply decide not to feel. Think of a familiar example. Someone spends a Sunday resting, reading, watching a movie, going for a walk, and by Sunday evening, they feel a sense of guilt that seems completely out of proportion to how the day actually unfolded. Not just, I could have been more productive, but something closer to, I was weak today. I wasted a day I'll never get back. While I was resting, everyone else was moving ahead. These thoughts are not neutral evaluations of productivity. They are moral judgments about character. And they carry so much emotional weight because the system has internalized productivity not as an option, but as a moral obligation. and rest not as a necessity but as something that must continually be earned and justified. The cost of this pattern is remarkably specific. It is not only the inability to fully rest, it is the inability to be fully present in a moment that is producing nothing. Attention remains divided between the present experience and the ongoing evaluation of what that experience is or is not accomplishing. And that split in attention has a consequence that goes far beyond guilt. It prevents the very thing rest was supposed to provide. Not only recovery, but the experience of being genuinely present in your own life. And that raises a question this video has pointed toward, but cannot answer on its own. Because the inability to stay present is not simply a consequence of guilt about productivity. It is part of a much broader pattern, a pattern that exists even when there is no guilt, even when you are being productive, even when everything is objectively fine. A mind that simply does not live in the present, a mind that spends most of its life somewhere else. There is a way of understanding the guilt of not being productive that completely changes what becomes possible to do with it, not as failure, as information. When the guilt of not being productive appears with the intensity and frequency we've explored throughout this video, it is pointing to something real, not about what you did or failed to do, but about how your system has been organized. It is signaling that, at some point, productivity became the primary source of support for your sense of self. That the motivation driving your work is, to a large extent, controlled motivation, aimed at avoiding the discomfort of feeling not good enough, rather than the genuine satisfaction of doing the work itself. That your system has internalized a moral hierarchy in which productivity equals virtue and rest equals laziness, and because of that, any space without productivity is interpreted as a threat to your sense of self and to the self-affirmation system built around it. This is not a sentence, it is a map, and a map, by definition, is different from the territory. Knowing where you are is not the same as being trapped there. What Lisa Feldman Barrett's theory of constructed emotion suggests, and perhaps the most practical insight from everything we've explored in this video, is that emotions built from learned predictions can, given enough time and the right kind of evidence, be reconstructed, not through decision, not through willpower, through updated predictions. Every time your system rests without being punished, every free afternoon that passes without the world falling apart, every moment of non-productivity that fails to produce the moral consequences your guilt predicted, your system receives a small update, not consciously, not dramatically, but genuinely. The constructed emotion of guilt gradually begins to be balanced by an emerging prediction that sometimes rest is simply rest, without a cost, without transgression, without any loss of worth. And decades of research by Edward Deci and Richard Ryan show that when the reasons for taking action begin to include more autonomous motivation, when productivity is guided not only by what silences guilt but also by what genuinely matters to you, the quality of that productivity changes. And little by little, rest can begin to occupy the place it was always meant to have, not as a reward that has been earned, not as a concession that must be justified, but as part of the cycle. This does not happen all at once, and it does not happen through internal speeches about deserving to rest. It happens through repeated experience, through periods of rest that your system lives through without catastrophe, without the collapse of your sense of self, and without the moral transgression your guilt kept insisting would happen. Subscribe to follow what comes next on this channel, because every video here builds on the one before it. And the next one connects everything we've explored today to something that goes beyond guilt and beyond productivity. The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism, published by sociologist Max Weber at the beginning of the 20th century, documents how the Protestant Reformation, particularly Calvinism, produced a profound cultural transformation that linked hard work with moral virtue and divine favor. Over the centuries, this connection migrated from a religious framework into a secular one, leaving behind the cultural equation between productivity and moral worth, and between rest and idleness that continues to operate subtly but powerfully throughout contemporary Western cultures. The theory of constructed emotion, developed by neuroscientist Lisa Feldman Barrett at Northeastern University, proposes that emotions are not automatic, hardwired responses to stimuli, but constructions the brain generates from predictions shaped by cultural learning and lived experience. The guilt of not being productive is therefore not an inevitable response to inactivity. It is the emotion your system has constructed based on what it has learned inactivity means, and with enough corrective experience that construction can be reshaped. Self-determination theory, developed by Edward D.C. and Richard Ryan at the University of Rochester, distinguishes between autonomous motivation, doing something because you genuinely want to, and controlled motivation, doing something to avoid guilt, preserve your self-image, or satisfy internal or external pressure. When productivity is driven primarily by controlled motivation, it becomes a source of identity. Productivity is what convinces the person that they are good enough. When productivity is absent, what emerges is not only guilt about behavior, but a threat to the very structure of the self. June Price Tangney's research at George Mason University distinguishes guilt from shame. Genuine guilt is focused on behavior, I did something wrong, and can be resolved through repair or change. Shame is focused on the self. There is something wrong with me, and has no equally direct resolution because the problem is no longer an action, but an identity. For systems that have built their identity around productivity, the shift from behavioral guilt to identity-based shame can happen quickly and almost automatically. Claude Steele's self-affirmation theory, developed at Stanford University, demonstrates that when an important area of the self is threatened, the system seeks to restore its sense of worth in any other available domain. This explains the familiar tendency to turn rest into another kind of task. It is not conscious self-sabotage, but the self-affirmation system attempting to restore the sense of value that productivity usually provides. Jonathan Haidt's research at New York University on moral emotions shows that behaviors which have been moralized, integrated into a person's value system as moral obligations rather than simple preferences, trigger emotional responses with the distinctive quality of moral transgression when they are violated. Once productivity has been moralized, rest produces more than the mild regret of an afternoon that could have been used differently. It generates the intense feeling of having committed a moral failure, which explains why the emotional response so often seems wildly disproportionate to the objective situation. If any part of this video described something you've experienced, that particular guilt of not being productive even when, rationally, everything pointed to rest being exactly what you needed, leave a comment, just one word, whatever stayed with you. Because recognizing where this pattern comes from is the beginning of developing a different relationship with it. But there is something that goes beyond the guilt of not being productive, and in some ways, it is even harder to name. Because guilt, at least, has an object. It says, you should be doing something else. It is uncomfortable, but it has a direction. What comes next is different. It is the experience of doing exactly what you should be doing, without guilt, without unfinished tasks, in a moment that is genuinely good, and still, even then, not being fully there. The mind that, in the middle of a wonderful lunch, is already thinking about dinner. That, during a genuinely meaningful conversation, is already partly inside the next one. That, on an afternoon that finally unfolded exactly as hoped, is already living inside tomorrow's to-do list. Not because of guilt, not because of obvious anxiety, simply because the present never quite feels fully present. As if the mind chronically lives just slightly ahead of the moment that is actually unfolding. Why does the mind keep living in the future even when the present is good? And what is the nervous system searching for on the horizon that makes it unable to fully settle into what is already here? That's what we'll explore in the next video.